This is the We Witches 3 podcast, where you will hear the opinion of 3 seasoned witches who are tired of glossy, tunnel vision, love and light accolades about serious metaphysical topics. Your host, Charlene, Maria Sewell, and Heather Woodworth have been practicing witches and professional psychics for over 20 years. They not only have the experience, but they have the research to back it up. So get comfortable on your brooms, grab a snack, and get ready for a wild ride.
Well, hello, I'm Kelden. I am the author of The Crooked Path, an introduction to traditional witchcraft. I am a traditional witch. I've been practicing for just a little over 13 years. And I'm a blogger. I YouTube. I do Instagram. I'm an avid researcher of all things witchcraft, history, and folklore. And I like to garden.
You had said at the very introduction of the book how this is the book that you wanted, that you wish you had had when you started on your witchcraft path.
Yeah.
And we were all talking about how, yes, when we had started, this would have been such a fantastic book.
Thank you.
Yeah, you obviously have put a lot of research into it. It's thorough, man. What I thought was especially fascinating is I had no idea about this Robert Cochrane guy.
Mm-hmm.
Would you mind telling us just a little bit about his history and what traditional witchcraft really is? Because I went into this book thinking a whole other thing.
Sure. I think the year 1951 is this really pivotal moment in what we can call the modern revival of witchcraft. And that's because 1951 is the year that the last Witchcraft Act is repealed in England. And so witchcraft is no longer illegal. And actually, under the 1735 Act, it was no longer a capital offense in England specifically, and, in the United Kingdom. So up until that point, it was still illegal, mostly because as we entered this age of enlightenment, it was no longer, people weren't convinced anymore that if somebody's a witch, they can hex you and cause supernatural harm. But that people who are claiming to have supernatural powers are just con artists, and they're trying to cheat people out of money and material goods. So 51 happened, and that's gone. And so people can now come out and just openly say, I'm a witch. You can write books about how to practice witchcraft. This is the year that Cecil Williamson opens his folklore center of witchcraft and superstition, and Gerald Gardner comes out of the woodwork. And as we know, he puts together his tradition that we now know today as Wicca. But while this is happening and Gardner is kind of going out into the media, there's stuff boiling in the background. There's other witches that are we're witches, we've been doing things, and our things are different than what you're saying. And this largely goes under the surface until after Gardner passes in 1964. This is when Robert Cochrane appears on the scene, and his first intro is through, I believe it was the Psychic News, was the periodical that he first published an article in, but later it was the newsletter called The Pentagram. And The Pentagram was the newsletter for the Witchcraft Research Association that had started. As you can tell, I'm super geeky about history.
Yes.
Put a quarter in me. But this research association was put together for the purpose of bringing together all of these covens and witches that were dispersed all over, with the idea that we were all going to come together and be a happy family. And that's absolutely not what happened. They have this newsletter, The Pentagram, and pretty much right away, Cochrane, he releases this article where he's I'm a witch, I do these things, I'm from this hereditary line, and Gardner is basically full of shit. This is not, he very adamant against Gardner's ideas. The funny thing is that most, if not all, of Cochrane's claims to be a hereditary witch have been debunked. He made it all up. But, that's also a really common thing back then. And I mean, it still is today, right? You think of the grandmother stories, because in order to seem cool and legit, you have to have an ancient family lineage of witches. And so people are whoa, there's this other witchcraft that's happening. That's not, what's coming out through Gardner. And Cochrane never wrote any books, so all we know about him comes through the writings of other people, through the articles that he published and through a series of letters that he sent to a few different people during the early 1960s. Wow. But he had his own coven called the Clan of Tubal Cain, which is still in existence today, which is pretty neat. And the big thing that happens is that in 1966, Doreen Valiente meets Robert Cochrane. And this comes at a time after she had had a falling out with Gardner's coven. And she had been kind of off searching for something new. And she meets Robert Cochrane and she's immediately taken with him. She's really impressed by his charisma, which is something that a lot of people take note of, is that he was a very charismatic man. And she's really impressed by the way he approaches witchcraft. His group works outdoors, which is really different from the Gardnerian coven, which primarily worked indoors. Cochrane's group also works robed versus skyclad. And I think that his version of witchcraft just spoke to her on a deep level. It felt more like home to her. And she is initiated into the Clan of Tubal Cain. At this point, things are going well, but Doreen pretty much quickly falls out of love with him. Not that she was in love with him, but just the amount that she was impressed with him quickly waned. And this was because he was so staunchly opposed to Gardner. He had this obsessional dislike. And I can just imagine him like constantly shit-talking. And you're just like, come on, dude. Like, let's focus on something else. Yes. The interesting thing is that there's evidence that at one point, Cochrane received at least a first-degree initiation into Gardnerian Wicca, which is interesting to note when we kind of break and we look into like some of the similarities between traditional witchcraft and Wicca. Things really hit the fan. Doreen talks about how one night Cochrane, hopefully jokingly, I mean, I hope so at least, talks about having a night of the long knives with the Gardnerians, which of course is a reference to a series of political executions. So he's basically joking about, engaging in violence with the Gardnerians. And Doreen's like, this is the final straw. And she tells him off and leaves his coven.
That's fair. That's totally fair.
And shortly thereafter, Cochrane actually committed suicide. So his relationship with his wife was really turbulent towards the end, and he had made some veiled threats of suicide. And on midsummer of 1966, he took a fatal dose of some sleeping pills and belladonna, and he died a few days later in the hospital.
Oh, wow.
So relatively brief period of like Cochrane coming out into the community of witchcraft, and we still know relatively little in comparison to other people and other figures in the history of modern witchcraft, but his teachings really live on through these letters and these articles. He wrote a series of letters to 3 different men, and you can find those letters online. They've been published in a book form. He was really big on like riddles and communicating through really cryptic messages. And so reading these letters can kind of be exhausting, but there's a lot of really interesting pieces kind of hidden in there. And in fact, in some of the letters that he's writing to people, he poses questions and gives them riddles that they then have to solve in order to discern different ways of practicing.
So it sounds like you've read all of those letters.
Yes.
That's awesome. Do you think that he just had a fondness for the riddles and being cryptic and stuff, or do you feel like that was kind of a test or a trial?
I think a little bit of both. He was known to be a pretty tricky person. So, for example, at one point, he was interviewed for a book called Witchcraft and the Sixth Sense by Justine Glass. And he later admitted that he basically gave this woman a lot of wrong information just for the fun of it.
Well, that's rude.
It's rude. So, I mean, in all honesty, Cochrane is kind of a douche. He's kind of a douche. He did some really important work. He contributed a lot of really awesome things. But he was kind of mean. He was kind of a jerk. And that comes out in his writing. But he was really big on being shifty and tricky and teaching by riddles and cryptic messages. And I think, right, some of it is as a test that, if you can solve this, then like you're worthy of moving forward, which I think that there's some merit to, and I think that that's still something that comes out in today's witchcraft in different work where authors write in kind of these really overly wordy, poetic, cryptic things. And the idea is that you have to work really hard to decipher what's going on in this.
Right. Yeah, I think that's kind of a classic teaching method, going back to like Plato and Socrates and all that. Yep. To kind of like have this questioning, like you need to do the work and that's the best way to learn kind of method. So I'm not going to harsh on that at all because it does work. But he sounds like a pretty interesting guy. But I think like that era was like, I'm not going to just say like he was the only one, but it seems like, you know, him and Gardner and stuff, there was a lot of ego happening in that era.
Yes. I think that is a very fair statement. Gardner certainly had ego. Alexander's had ego.
All of them had ego.
It's just changed a lot, is what I'm saying, in the last 60 years. The community has, which is a fascinating topic. We three have been discussing a lot lately, like how much the community has changed and expectations.
Definitely.
I find your amount of research, the fact that you use so many primary documents in your references throughout the book is amazing. I really wish like the books I had read when I was a young witch had done that more often instead of just kind of like vaguely alluding to things they had read once or been told.
Yeah, that's what me and Charlie were talking about before we started. I was like, if we only had this when we first started, that would have been a whole lot better. Because I mean, it clears up a lot of questions, and instead of, like she was saying, like alludes to just sort of like, well, we do this. We're not going to tell you why we do this, but just know that this is what has to happen. And you're just like, okay.
Right.
The way that you've broken things down throughout the entire book has been really fantastic. Like you go to the baby basics.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really nice. I was reading the section on power, and you discussed the differences between external power and internal power. So, like, the difference between, like, exactly where external power comes from. And there is a huge debate about, like, whether or not that is granted purely by spirits or if that is also coming from our environment as well. And the fact that you listed it all out, like, yes, it comes from everything, was really refreshing and nice to read.
Thank you.
I think that it's going to be really fantastic. You're not just for beginners, but for people with more experience as well, because you also cited your references.
Yes. And that was like a really big thing. It's like, I am really big, like when I read books, I want citations. Like I want to know where things are coming from. And I think part of that just comes from like my experiences in college and in graduate school, and like writing papers and being like, you have to cite everything. And just putting myself in the shoes of the reader. Like if I'm, I want my reader to be able to be like, oh, here's this thing you talked about. Well, I want to fact check that for myself. Or I want to know more. Here's where you got that from. Now I can go and check that for myself.
Exactly. And I know for me, when I was reading books, back in the early and mid 90s, like people were just pulling stuff out of their butt.
Right.
Yeah.
And it kind of like, you weren't always sure, like, is this based in like an actual tradition or are you pulling it out of your butt? And pulling it out of your butt is fine, but like, just say so, because a lot of times we do discover things through personal experience and they absolutely have value, but like, please mention that.
Yes.
But in my experience, I have discovered that.
Thank you. Yeah, I love research. That's kind of like a joke between me and my siblings. They kind of make fun of me because I'm always talking about research. But I love just poring over books and falling down rabbit holes where like 2 hours later I emerge and literally I was searching for like the most smallest detail and it took me like hours to find. I love filling notebooks with notes, and I just love all of that. I've always loved school, and I think that that's just an extension of that love for reading and academics.
Oh, you are a full-on nerd, and I say that as a compliment.
Mm-hmm. I am. I'm a huge, like, when it comes to folklore and witchcraft, like, I am a total nerd.
Now, I want to, like, jump right into some controversy.
Yes.
So, you recently did a video about the devil in witchcraft practice.
Yes.
And you also go over in the book the witch father and the witch mother. as part of traditional witchcraft. And in the Witch Father section, you do also talk about how the devil pretty much is the Witch Father.
Yep.
So, would you like to explain that?
Sure. So, I guess, like, the first thing just to note is that, like, I can speak from my personal experience and for just what I've researched and heard from other people's experiences. Because witchcraft in general is just so broad, it's hard to make broad brushstrokes. And one thing that I was really careful about saying in the book and in my other work is just, like, not all witches work with the devil. Not all traditional witches work with the devil.
Mm-hmm.
Because not all witches even work with a deity.
Mm-hmm.
But in my practice and in what I've learned through my years as a traditional witch is there's these two archetypes. And part of this is just my own kind of falling somewhere between like hard polytheism, where like all deities and spirits are individual autonomous beings, and soft polytheism, where it's like they're all one. I find myself somewhere in the middle. And as part of that, there's the Witch Father and the Witch Mother. And they're composed of all these different deities and spirits that end up being one while also being autonomous. And I don't know if that makes sense outside of my own head. So there's this idea of the Witch Father. And when we look at witchcraft historically and in folklore, you find witches working with the devil. And one of the things I always point out to people is that when you look into that lore, you don't find witches working with Pan or other permutations of the pagan horned god that we know today that's really popular. You find them working with the devil. That's just part of our heritage. That's part of the narrative that we are a part of and pulling from. And people don't like that. And there's a lot of good reasons to that. So I always talk about how going back to the 1950s, when people are coming forward to the public and talking about being witches, is they really want to distance themselves from being feared and trying basically to placate the public and be like, we're not a threat, we're not bad people. So some people have kind of called this like the watering down of witchcraft.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if I necessarily like jive with that, just because I tend to look at more of the like personal aspects underneath it, like the reasons why people were doing this. And I don't think it was because people were, I don't know, being lazy or stupid or anything like that. I think it was really good reason, because even though it was no longer like you couldn't necessarily be legally punished for being a witch, like you could still be pretty severely harassed, and there were still risks of harm and, things like losing your job, potentially losing your children. So it's really important to have the public not be scared of you. And as part of that, it's, we don't work with the devil. There's no devil in the craft. And while I think that helped gain witchcraft some semblance of like societal acceptance, I think it did some harm, just in that, today now, whether you're a traditional witch working with the devil, whether you're like a satanic witch, like there's a lot of backlash.
There really, really is. And I know, like, in my youth, I used to really disparage, Wiccans in particular, I'm just going to say it, as being, like, Christianity with a skirt.
Sure.
So I know a lot of people felt that way, too. But you're right. Like, I know when I was growing up, it was very much like, you keep it secret. Or you might be kicked out of school, or who knows what'll end up on your doorstep. Your family could lose their jobs, like... even in my youth, I was a risk to my family. So.
Right. So with the devil, when we look back into history, there's this idea, and people talk about it in different contexts, but this idea that like anything that wasn't the Christian God was labeled a demon or the devil. And I think that, right, that makes sense, because, right, if it's not the Christian God, then who is it? It must be the devil. And so collectively, different spirits and deities get put into this catch-all, and they kind of coalesce in this cauldron. And and a lot of this, of course, is is speculation because we don't necessarily know. We don't know like if there were people practicing witchcraft, and certainly if they were, it's nothing like it looks like today. But just kind of this idea that like these spirits were put together under this heading and kind of handed back to the people as the devil. And that survived into popular folklore. So when we look into folklore, all of these spirits get labeled as the devil. And in the witch trials, in the transcripts, this narrative comes out as of the devil. And what are the evils really that he is presiding over? There are things like feasting, acts of pleasure, music, dancing, basically all of the things that we like to do as humans, and that the church was like, absolutely don't do these things. And I just like to think that like if I lived back then and they were like, well, you can either worship our God who demands that you repress your human nature, or this devil who's like, you should eat good food and dance and have fun, I'm gonna have to go the route of the devil. And as like modern pagans, like, you know, if you use that label, or even if, I guess if you don't use that label too, like I think those are all things that we all really enjoy, like good music and dancing. Like I just think of like going to like pagan like festivals, and it's
I think you're forgetting sex.
Yes, and sex. Yes. So I use this quote a lot, and it's a quote by Gemma Gary, and she just has a way of like putting things really beautifully into words. And I pulled this aside because I knew I was going to end up quoting it, but she says, ironically, it may perhaps be the church in its keenness to eradicate adherence to pagan divinity by grafting and projecting it onto the diabolical that has unwittingly most thoroughly preserved the potency, liberation, and illumination of the old one and handed him back to the witches as the devil. And when you start to move into more modern folklore, and by modern, I mean more like not classic, not like Greeks and stuff, but the devil's a lot less spooky. He's more of a trickster. He's more of a shapeshifter. He tests you. He tests your character. And I include a story in the book, The Black Woodsmen. And it's really this story about a man who is greedy, and his character is put to test by the devil. And of course he fails, and he ends up being punished. The devil takes him away, and his house gets struck by lightning and burns down, and all the money in his bank turns to ash. And you find stories like this, where the devil is essentially testing people's moral character. And when they fail, they're punished. And you find, in my experience working with the devil, that happens. He's not scary. Somebody recently was asking me about this. Like, well, aren't you scared? Doesn't he bring you fear? And I don't feel scared of him, right? I mean, like any other relationship, it can be testing at times, right? Like he's definitely not someone who's going to sugarcoat things. Like he'll smack you on your ass if you need to, or if he needs to. So there's that aspect of it. As for like the specific kind of spirits that I think he really encompasses, on one hand, he's really representative of our own human nature and our basic primal instincts, right? Like I think it's really popular today when we talk about shadow work and like our shadow self. And for me, that's part of my work with the devil, is really going into those primal dark spaces of who I am. And that can be really challenging and frightening, but that's hard work that needs to be done. And it's about embracing who we are on the most physical level, kind of just going back to some of those evils. It's our human animal nature, if you will. And on the concept of nature, he also is nature itself. He's wild and chaotic. One thing that's really fascinating is you look around the world and you find tons and tons of landmarks that bear his name, like Devil's Punch Bowl, Devil's Chair, Devil's Kettle. And the idea is that the devil somehow created those landmarks. He's sculpting the earth, which is really funny when you think about it, because I feel like that's very in contradiction to some of what is said in the Bible about God creating earth. And there's other instances. So in certain places, it used to be popular that you would reserve like a section of your field or the field adjacent to your house. and you just let it grow wild. And this is called the Devil's Acre or the Devil's Plantation. And it's a sacrifice to him so that your crops will do well and that he won't be tempted to blight them or anything like that.
I learned that tradition as well, but I learned that it was for the fairies.
Yep. So the devil is often connected to the fairies. In certain child transcripts, he's described as a fairy. He will be described as like the consort to the Queen of Elfame, or the Queen of the Fairies. He'll be described wearing clothes that are traditionally kind of seen as fairy-esque, so like wearing green. In certain instances in Sweden, he wore this really colorful blue and red outfit with colorful ribbons. And so on one level, he's very much connected to the fairies. I see him also being connected with the Green Man, and there's a lot of really interesting lore about those foliate faces that we love. And it's surprisingly a lot more modern than we think, but I still see that very much as an extension of him. So he's very dual-natured. On one hand, he's the light bringer and he's the life giver, and we see this sometimes in different strands of traditional witchcraft. People will talk about Lucifer, right? He's this beautiful light-bringing angel, and whether you're looking at that through like a very biblical context or you're looking at it through like the lore around Aradia and the Gospel of the Witches. Other times he's described as being Azazel, one of the watchers from the Book of Enoch, who, you know, these angels come down and they're supposed to watch over humanity, but they end up like lusting after the women, and they procreate and they create the Nephilim, these horrific monster giants, but they also teach humans all of these different skills. And some of those skills include like how to use enchantments and how to use herbs. So in some ways, the devil also carries that like Promethean aspect of like, I'm bringing divine illumination to humans, even though I'm going to get in trouble for this. So sometimes it's referred to as the light betwixt the horns. It's that flame that burns in between his horns. It's the divine illumination. At the same time, he's also the Lord of the Mound. He's the chthonic god of death. In this aspect, he can be seen as the leader of the wild hunt, they fly out on stormy nights, and they're heralding in souls of the dead. And throughout lore, you find different leaders. Sometimes they're male, sometimes they're female. There's also, in different regions, the idea of like the black dog. So in East Anglia, Black Shuck, who's an omen of death, sometimes even bringing death itself. So he's all these things, and he's not easily pigeonholed. And that's very much been my experience with spirits in general, is that it's really hard to say definitively like who they are and what they do. And especially with the devil and with the fairies too. Like the second that you're like, oh, this is it, I've got it, they're like, haha, absolutely not. We're gonna flip it the other way. So they're really resistant. He's really resistant to being pigeonholed. And again, he's a shapeshifter and a trickster. So you never really quite have his number. You get close, but then there's another mystery to be found.
Right. Now, I wanted to ask you, too, about the way you use the word folklore throughout the book. And you've done it several times throughout this interview as well. But when I think of folklore, I think like going way, way back. But you usually are referencing much more recent folklore. And a lot of times in the book, you're specifically referring to the testimony we get during the witch trials.
Yes.
And I think that's really, really fascinating, using the witch trials as kind of a primary source. But you do also do a lot of like reading between the lines of what that testimony is.
Right. So with folklore, I mean, folklore doesn't have to be old, right? It can be very, very old, but it can also be very new. It's part of just our living tradition of ways that we express and interpret the world around us. And with the witch trials, this was actually a conversation that I had with my editor, because she was like, well, you know, you really need to put some disclaimers in there about, you know, why it's okay to use these trial transcripts. Why, just given the fact that a lot, if not most of them, were obtained under torture. People would have, confessed to anything just to get out of pain and the possibility of death. And I tend to look at it as like, even if everything that was said in every single confession was completely fabricated, it still created a body of lore. And some of that we look at and we're like, well, also a lot of what they were saying had to have come from something already existing. And that's not necessarily to say that, that they were part of some secret witch cult or that they were, referencing some secret group that was actually meeting, but it came from pre-established beliefs about what it meant to be a witch and what it meant to practice witchcraft. And they took those things and then they were put into these confessions, and those confessions changed them up and furthered them. And that followed in, like, for example, like going way more into relative times, like different people, like specifically Margaret Murray, right? She takes stuff from the witch trials and she develops her hypothesis about the witch cult, which of course we know today isn't accurate. But then you have people like Gardner who took the work of Murray and added it into his work. And then his work was added into more people's work. And I don't think a lot of people understand that a lot of the real kind of classic ideas we have about witchcraft come from those trial transcripts. Like the idea of like coven being 13, even things like the 4 kind of greater Sabbath come from trial transcripts. They come from confessions. And of course they've gone through different changes and adaptations, but at their bare bones, we're still, even if we don't realize it, pulling from that narrative. We're pulling from the folklore that those confessions generated.
Yeah, see, and I thought that was so fascinating because you did make the point that, like, the people who were making those confessions, even if they were fabricating, were drawing at least on stories they had already heard.
Mm-hmm.
Which is me just rephrasing what you already just said, but, like, in a way that sounds simpler to me.
Yes. I have a very long-winded way of explaining things.
and that's okay, because yeah, exactly. It's great for a writer, but yeah, just like the whole idea that they were confessing things based on a oral tradition that had already been passed on, stories that they were told themselves, and then they were retelling that and elaborating on them in their own confessions. So we can kind of see the history of those stories by reading their confessions. Is really fascinating, and I had never thought of it that way.
Mm-hmm.
Like, we're taught, like, both in the community and, like, in school to just disregard everything they said as fiction.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, I would never have thought to go back to their confessions as a source of real lore.
And we can pull inspiration, and that's largely what we do within traditional witchcraft, is by looking at these sources, we find pieces of inspiration that we can pull out and then adapt to our modern times and our modern lives. So it's not that we're looking at trial transcripts and trying to recreate exactly what they said, because that just wouldn't be practical. And I'm really big on, like, if it doesn't have practical application to your life and where you're at, then it's probably not going to have very much meaning and not very much of an effect. We can look at the lore, and we can find inspiration and find new ways of practicing. And that's why I think it's sad when we're taught that, like, we should just completely disregard. Like, we should go into it with the mindset of, like, these things aren't necessarily factual. We'll never know if these things happened. The likelihood that they happened exactly this way are very slim, but that doesn't mean they're not useful.
In the exercises, you start out really basic with the exercises with, like, your standard visualizations and, like, journal exercises, and I love the exercises in the book so much.
Yay.
But then you go on and you actually share, like, real recipes and real spells and real rituals.
Yep.
And I kind of had my eyebrow up because you share beneficial and baneful recipes and spells in equal amounts. My personal moral compass is a bit more on the gray side, but I'm always surprised to see an author do it, especially an author who comes across as sweet as you do.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that's not the first time you've heard that, but, like, I've watched a bunch of your videos on your YouTube, and you just come off, like, so darn adorable, and then to see, like, some real baneful stuff in the book was kind of a shock.
I don't know. There's so many things that I could attribute that to. I mean, growing up, I was obsessed with, like, all of the evil fairy tale witches.
Yes.
and part of it too, I mean, like astrologically, like I'm a Libra Scorpio cusp. So I have this like really like chill, like let's be fair and kind, but then I'm also like, but I'll also fuck your shit up in the most insidious way possible. You know,
I completely missed that about you. Completely.
Like, I will bake you. I will bake you a pie, but it might be full of belladonna berries.
Yeah. I was actually watching the video that you did, the like how to get to know your witch or what have you.
Uh-huh.
And you were talking about how you're like very even. You're very like. Because I have a lot of Libra, so I related to what you were saying. Like, my chart is like Libra going wild and crazy. I have like 3 or 4 Libra planets in Libra and whatever, or houses or whatever. So I was like, oh my god, that is so me. Like, I so understand what you're saying. But at the same time, I have like Scorpio and like some other ones, and I'm just like, yeah, exactly. It's like everybody's fair, everything's good. But if I have to fuck you up,
right,
I'm okay with that.
And one thing I want to say is like the recipes and the spells in the book are really, the whole book is super personal, but I mean, I'm just like, if I'm going to put recipes and spells in here, I want them to be ones that are actually coming from my magical book. And with the baneful stuff, one thing, and again, this kind of goes into also like that kind of wanting to reassure the public that witches are not going to eat your babies, is that there was a really big push for like, witches don't hex, witches don't curse. And a lot of times this comes up a lot, and especially, and it's always geared at like Wiccans that like, and I think that there's some fairness in that a lot of times you come across people and they're like, oh my gosh, like don't hex people, don't do that, like no, threefold law. But I think a lot of that stems from like misunderstandings, because when you start to look at a lot of traditional Wicca and the history of Wicca as it was developing, like that wasn't a thing.
Mm-hmm.
Like the threefold law and the Wiccan Rede weren't really a thing. And there was a lot of fucking hexing going on. Like those covenants were nasty. Like it was like, she left our coven and we need to drag her back, so we're gonna summon an owl demon to go get her. And I don't think it's really until we start getting into like the 60s and onwards that we start seeing more. It wasn't until 1960, 65 or 64 when Doreen publicly spoke just the 8-word Wiccan Rede. This is another area that I'm really passionate about. And just because I think, and it's not to say, and the thing is that like people who follow the Wiccan Rede or the threefold law, like I don't think that they're stupid or dumb, because that's how they're choosing to live their life. It's when you start to like push it on other people that I think it is a problem. But I think it's also just as much as a problem as how much shit people give them for following it. And I'm just like, let's just do our thing and leave each other alone. But with that, I don't subscribe to the idea of the threefold law. I don't subscribe to the Wiccan Rede. And again, I don't mean that in a disparaging way at all. It's just that I don't see that as being very practical for me, because harm is an inevitable part of life. Like, we're always causing harm, whether we even know it or not, even on just like the most minimal level that we don't even think about, like our impact on the environment. And, or just, saying something that we don't even realize hurts somebody's feelings. Like, hurt's just part of the human experience. But I also don't think, just to back up a second, I don't think that even the Wiccan Rede was originally meant to be this really, like, harsh mandate, right? Because we look at the word read, and it just means counsel. It just means advice. And I think advising somebody to just try not to be a dick is a good thing.
Yes.
Don't go around causing harm just because, like, don't hex somebody just because they cut you off on the road. Like magically and just physically, right? Like the laws of physics, like things have a reaction. And so when we hex somebody, we're tapping into something darker, and that can have effects on us. And so that's why I'm always, cautious and telling people that, at least for me, I approach hexing as very much a last resort. Like, I've gone through all of the mundane channels, and now I've gotten to a place where I'm like, okay, now I'm going to take matters to the witchcraft and get out the doll and get out the pins, get out the herbs, and we're going to go to town.
That's how I see it too. Like, I normally don't go that route unless it's like last resort. And that's what I don't like about some people, that people think that just because you're a witch, oh, you know, I rolled my eyes at you, that's it, she's gonna hex me. And I'm like, are you kidding me? Like, get a grip.
Like, I've got better things to do.
Yeah, exactly. Like, it takes money to buy those herbs, okay? Like, you are not worth 6 cents or anything.
I am busy, man. I have other things to do. Like, I just don't have the time.
Right. And just like with the devil, like when people say like there's no devil in the craft, I mean, like, okay, what I'm hearing you say is that there's no devil in your craft, which is totally valid and cool. Just like when I hear people say like witches don't hex, I just translate that back as like, no, you don't hex. Because historically, again, witches were hexing people all the time. And we can look at that so many different ways. I tend to look at it as like witchcraft has always been for the disenfranchised. It's been for the people who didn't necessarily have the resources to protect themselves, or who the justice system has failed. And so they've had to take matters into their own hands. So, and classically speaking, like in the witch trials, like that would have come out in ways like, I'm going to destroy your crops so that you don't have food to eat. I'm going to kill the lord of my village because he's, you know, abusing me.
Or all of us.
Right, or all of us. We're going to take down, like, for example, one of my favorite stories, and this comes up a lot too, because just as kind of a side tangent, like, there's a lot of times this discussion about, like, well, witchcraft shouldn't be political. Well, like, I'm not going to say it, witchcraft has always been political. And again, I translate that when people say that as, like, my witchcraft isn't political, because, for example, I mean, like, the North Berwick Coven in Scotland, their whole thing was that they were trying to take down King James I. Well, I guess he wasn't King James I at the time, but he later became King James I when he went to England. Their whole thing is that they were trying to take him down. It was like a political coup.
So I think it's weird that we have this weird separation of like politics and not politics in society, because politics is just like life, ethics, and morals.
Right.
I don't know how you can separate that out from everything else.
So witches have always been working baneful magic. That's, again, just part of our heritage. And you don't have to. And that's the biggest thing, is like, you don't have to hex. Like, and, you know, if you don't, that doesn't make you less of a witch. Just like if you do, it doesn't make you less of a witch.
Mm-hmm.
You do what you need to do.
Yeah, so one thing I did really enjoy, because, like, those are definitely things that are in my practice as well. But I had to confront my own feelings about them, because I was reading the book and I was like, this is such a great book for beginners, da, 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 da. And then there was all these things like discussion of the devil and baneful practices and hexing and stuff included in the book. And I was like, oh, I've always been taught, like, we don't teach this to newbies. We don't discuss this with beginners. And I was like, now I have to question all that stuff. And so and from that aspect, I really appreciated reading the book, because I was like, yeah, why don't we do that? Like, we should be, why is there the whole, like, yes, we acknowledge that we do baneful things, but then we're going to hold it back right now.
Right. Well, and I guess I look at that kind of like, if not now, when? Right? Because beginners already know. I mean, largely, I feel like it's safe to say that beginners already know that, like, hexing and cursing is a thing. And I think it's better to talk about it up front than to be like, well, we'll talk about it when you're a little bit older. Meanwhile, the kids are off, like, you know, pulling out the monk's hood and doing things in a not so great way. Or, you know, again, just to use an early example, like, somebody cut you off on the road. So now you're like, well, I can do this thing, so I'm going to do it. And it doesn't end very well.
Yeah, so I love that, like, alongside, because I don't want to, like, you know, give the representation that you're only talking about, like, the shadow or dark side of stuff here. Alongside all the normal stuff you would expect to find in a book on witchcraft tradition, you are discussing the shadow or dark side of that in the same breath. So, and I thought that was just really wonderful and fantastic. Like, you're going into it being like, this is how you approach herbs. And if you're using poisonous herbs, this is how you approach them too.
Yes. Well, and so to that, I'll just say, I mean, that really at the heart of traditional witchcraft is also this big piece about animism, and that there's spirit in all things, and that we work with those spirits. So, like, even when we're approaching, like, using an herb in a spell, like, we're not just approaching this, like, inert material. We're approaching a spirit. And it's good to just be mindful and kind to that spirit. So again, we kind of, I guess you're right. Like, there's this element of, like, oh, like, we're being really nice and sweet, but there's some other things too. Like, just being mindful of our relationship with the world of spirits, because we're all working together, and those can be really powerful allies.
Absolutely. And there are also some other topics that I think are probably more integral to traditional witchcraft that we don't talk about in, or at least we don't talk about the same way in more mainstream witchcraft, like the hedge
crossing.
Hedge crossing, yes, that. Like, jumping the hedges, crossing the hedges. Yeah. What are we doing with hedges again?
Yes, the hedge crossing. You can climb them. You can do all kinds. The idea is just that you're going over.
But nobody has ever been like, okay, this is the thing with the hedges, and no one has really, like, stuck to that phrasing. Everyone's like, oh yeah, that's just what we call astral projection, but, like, it really isn't. It's a different thing.
Right. Well, and I wrote an article quite a long time ago, kind of talking about the difference between, like, hedge crossing and astral projection and visualization, and kind of, because that was a question I was getting a lot, is like, what is the difference? And so hedge crossing essentially is that your spirit is leaving your body and you're crossing over into the other world. And I think you could maybe classify, I think there is some overlap with astral projection, because, like, in the book, I talk about how the other world can be broken down into these broad kind of three realms, right? There's this upper world, there's the mid-world, and there's the lower world. And the mid-world is where we are at now as physical people, as well as kind of this hidden spiritual landscape behind it. And that's kind of where we are when we cross the hedge. We're kind of in this, when we're in the mid-world, we're kind of in this in-between of our physical mundane world and just that hidden landscape behind it. And again, this is because in traditional witchcraft, working with spirits is so fundamental to just everything we do. And instead of always having the spirits come to us, we like to go to them, because then we get to see them interacting in their worlds. And there's a lot of power in that world that we can harness and use. So just as you could do a spell or ritual here and here and now, you could also do a spell or ritual in the other world. And it would have maybe some different outcomes or different ways of working.
Yeah, I thought that was really fascinating that you discussed, like, not only how to do that, but, like, a lot of the different ways you described were very, like, the old tales, with the broom and the flying ointment and, like, that whole stuff. And I was like, oh, this is how it all goes together. Because it's so hard to find all of that in, like, a comprehensive discussion or how to. Like, you only hear it alluded to here and there, and you've managed to put it all together, like, in a step-by-step guide.
Flying ointment is also, like, an area that I'm so passionate about, because I remember very early on in my witch years, like, you would come across references in books, and they'd be like, but we don't do that. Like, that's not a thing.
So frustrating.
And it is absolutely a thing. And as I've grown in years and researched more and more into this topic and just seen how it's being embraced by other people, I was like, okay, I absolutely need to write about this, because, I got to get my 2 cents out there on it, because I think it can be a really fantastic aid in spirit flight and in crossing the hedge. But I also don't think it's the be-all, end-all. And I don't think there's all this, like, really juicy lore around it, and these poison plants, and specifically the nightshades, which I just adore. I love them. I grow them. It's great. But, like, they're also not the be-all, end-all of flying ointment. And the recipe I give in my book doesn't contain them, because I know for beginners, it's better to go with something a little more light, and not light in the fact that it's not going to be potent and effective, but it's going to be a much different experience than if you just dive in head first.
Also, they can be hard to acquire.
Yes. And another thing, too, is, like, I also know that people are going to want to make their own, because I wanted to make my own flying ointments. And I talk in the book about the pros and cons of that. But if you're going to make one, you're really going to need a lot of experience and background knowledge if you're going to use those poison plants. But you can also use other things. So that was an area in the book that I was also, I mean, I was passionate about the whole thing, but just one area where I was like, I feel like this is knowledge that isn't necessarily put out there in clear, concise ways for readers, and I want to change that.
I think these are the things that we do as witches, or we talk about, but we don't really air it. It's like amongst each other, we talk about these kinds of things, like everything in the book, like even the rule of three. We all talk about this stuff, and we bitch about it because the only Wiccans use rule of three, and everybody else is like WTF. But
yeah.
But like we don't really put it in books. We don't really talk about it outside of like our group of friends or our community. And so it's interesting to have it's actually awesome to have a book where like, okay, let's just throw it down. Let's throw down the gauntlet and let's like just give it to you. Here you go. Here's what being a witch is about. It's not just about love and light. It's not just about the rule of three. It's not just about Gardenarians. It's not just about all this bullshit you see on Facebook. This is what we're actually doing.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, we hack the fuck out of people sometimes.
Yes, because they deserve it.
And like Heather said, like there's a whole lot of like, oh, talking about it in a book. Oh, that's new. Yeah, I had recipes for flying ointment, but they were like in the weird ass books that my mom had that were like sort of off limits. But you know, everyone was like, "Oh, you don't use stuff from that book." Like someone wrote it down, so.
Right.
Yeah, I had a friend who like literally looked like he had a heart attack the minute that I was like, yeah, I'm making flying ointment and I'm using these ingredients, and he was like, oh my god, and I was like, okay, like relax, like, oh my god.
We didn't talk very much about the actual traditional witchcraft path other than the history, but I was really horrified to discover that there was this whole other branch of witchcraft that had developed kind of at the same time period as Wicca that I had no clue about.
And I think that, I mean, you're not alone in that, and that was very much my experience when I discovered traditional witchcraft. And it was only through I had reached this point in my practice where I was like, I'm feeling at a plateau. And I was like, okay, I'm gonna go and I'm gonna start researching. And I went and I turned to the books of, you know, the people who began it. You know, I read Gardner and Valiente, and it was only through that I was like, oh, here's this other path, right, that's developing at the same time, but that we don't really hear much about. And that's changing. There's more and more and more books and articles and things being published all the time now about traditional witchcraft. And I think it's becoming more, and it does every like so often, it kind of spikes back up in like the mainstream witchcraft community. And I think right now it's the biggest spike that it's probably ever had. But right, for a long time, like there weren't books being written about traditional witchcraft. That's really only been within like the last decade, maybe, that books that are more accessible, right? Because even like, you know, Troy Books does a fantastic job and they produce these just beautiful work, but they're still relatively inaccessible. You can't go to Barnes & Noble and get them. Like
having the special order books is, like, being able to is really nice, but for someone who's browsing for resources, it's much easier to have something that's accessible, because it's kind of like looking for information on Google. If you don't know what word you're supposed to use, then you're kind of just up shit creek.
Right. And the other thing too, and again, just to touch back too, is that books are expensive, and not everybody can afford to go out and buy these books. And so I just want to acknowledge the amount of privilege that I've had to be able to access good like academic texts. Because that's another thing too, you know, just to kind of really throw on a tangent, is a lot of times we look at people and we're kind of like, oh, like they don't know this, like how could they be so dumb? And I'm totally guilty of that. right? Like, and I'm not saying that I'm like innocent. Like, there have been times where like I've encountered somebody, I'm like, how did they not know that? But then I have to look back at it and be like, well, you've also had the privilege of being able to afford like all of this research, and other people haven't, or they don't, depending on even where they're at. Like, maybe it's not even about money, but just like your life circumstances, you don't always have access to really good resources, and so you don't know.
And like, I know the last town I lived in Arizona did not even have a bookstore. Like, didn't have one. Not even a used bookstore. So there's no like going down to the shop and browsing.
Right. And in the small town that I live in, like, our local library doesn't have any books on witchcraft. Like, absolutely zero. And so, I mean, you're not always going to find resources. And a lot of times when you do find resources, they're going to be books that a lot of people nowadays look down on. And so then you learn these things and you're doing the best you can, and then people shit on you.
Yeah, the community kind of needs to stop that. Like, it's fine to suggest better resources, but to like poo-poo people is really shitty.
Yeah. It's really unnecessary too. Like, it's more like ego, just plain old ego in my opinion, half of the time.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a whole other topic is what it is.
I know. See, this is the thing, is I can just go. I can go in so many directions. And I feel bad because I didn't even talk about like defining traditional witchcraft.
I know, that's what I was saying. Like, we didn't really get into the meat and bones of traditional witchcraft. But I'm glad that we went over the history so people know that there's an alternative to Wicca. We're not worried about dogma. We're much more animistic. It's much more use what you have at hand, not such an emphasis on the props and tools and what you can gather, the buying of the shit. If you go on like a long part when you're talking about the tools of the trade, you go on a long thing about like crafting your own items and finding them in thrift stores and antique shops. And I was just like, yes, stop buying the expensive things that you're probably going to hate.
Right. And this is also like just a topic that's come up in the community recently about like buying things and materialism, which good conversation is hopefully happening around it. But I've just discovered like over my years of practice that like you tend to have this like urge right away to go out and buy the things, and the books normally talk like they're like, oh well, you don't need these things to be a witch, but now we're going to go on at length about them and use exercises and things where we use them, and if you don't have them, we're not going to talk about like, well, what do you do now? So when I was writing this, I was like, oh god, I'm at a tools chapter, and I'm like, okay, how would I have wanted a tools chapter? And just talking about like, don't rush out and buy things because you likely already have something in your house that you can use. And if you go out and do that, like if you're buying it out of that anxiety, then you're most likely not going to establish like a deep relationship with it, versus like if you wait and you find it eventually, or you make it yourself. And that also gets into just, things about like our impact on the environment, like in a very big picture way. It's like a lot of times, I guess like in books that I was reading when I first started, like there was this idea of like, oh, you don't want to own like secondhand witchcraft tools. Like that's gross and icky.
Yeah.
And I don't, I've never had that. And I'm sure right. Like you could go to an antique store and find some like tool and it's actually like cursed and your hair falls out or something. But
there's a lot of TV shows about that. Yeah.
I like the idea of having a magical tool that somebody else has used and that there's a legacy and a story to it. And also that like we're also just recycling. A lot of stuff that's being mass produced is questionable. And I'm not saying like I'm like anti-buying things, because I love buying things specifically from other witches who craft things, right? That's how we can support our community. And buying mass produced things too. Like I do that too. I'm not like some anti-consumerism saint, but I really like the idea of like going to antique stores, and some of that comes, Doreen Valiente talks about that in her book, and it's just such a cool idea. Like I just found a brand new cast iron cauldron at a local antique store, and it's amazing what you can find. So being creative about tools.
I love going to like finding the thrift store or antique store where like the estate sales end up at.
Yes.
And so I find a lot of my silver plates and silver platters that way. It's so much nicer to be like, this was well loved for 40 years and now it's in my home and I'm using it too.
Yeah. Most of my things are actually like my mom's hand-me-downs.
Oh, wow. That's
Yeah.
cool.
But no, but my mom's not a witch. But it's like, you know, it's like something that like she's had for years. So there's that energy there still.
Mm-hmm.
So I have a lot of that. Everything else was gifted to me. Like my cauldron, my aftermath. I was like, oh, I'm very lucky.
Yeah.
We have this weird dichotomy where we have like this super emphasis on hereditary and like receiving things that were passed down for generations, and also this aversion to secondhand items. Just like what?
Right.
And you're like, wait a minute, what? How does that? What? Huh?
Exactly. Like, how can you do both?
I think it has to do with more the beauty of the receiving, of how you receive it. Because I think it has to do with like if it's like a hand-me-down, it's like, I've used this tool for so many years, and now I've given it to you because I trust you that you will use it correctly. Blah 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 blah. So there's that. I think that's where it comes from. It's that beauty to hand me down something to someone. But then when you buy it at a thrift shop, I think the idea is that it's like, oh, you're buying something that somebody didn't want, you know. And I think that's where it comes from, that dislike of it. And that's the only thing I could think of that would be the negative. It's something that somebody doesn't want or doesn't need.
That's a really excellent point.
Oh.
For me, when I take things to thrift stores, it's like I have this beautiful item and I don't know anyone who needs it, but I want it to find another life somewhere. So I assume that's everyone else's intent too.
Mm-hmm.
That they're just like, so when I go to a thrift store, I think all these items people didn't need anymore, but they want them to live on, and that's why they didn't bin them.
Mm-hmm.
That's how I see it sometimes. That's why I'm like, oh man, this is like I love going to thrift stores. There's I used to live in West Palm, and it's a town where I live, and they had like thrift stores on every corner, and I was like, oh, I'm in heaven.
Yeah. Plus, like, you can always tell if an item has a bad attitude or not, because you're meeting it first.
Yeah.
Right.
While your book is focused on traditional witchcraft, it is not just for those interested in traditional witchcraft.
Yes. So, like you said earlier, I think that so many different people will find value in this book because essentially, and I talk about this, is that we're drawing from the same roots, we're growing from the same tree, and so we're all connected in that way, and we can learn valuable things from each other. And so, like, you might read this book, and some of it might be like, oh, like, that's cool, but it doesn't really vibe with me. And you might find things that you're like, oh, wow, like, this really does vibe with me. And I talk about that, too, you know, like, if you're reading this, like, it might be that you are interested in traditional witchcraft, or it might just be that you're curious to know more. And, you know, you're already part of a tradition, or you're not necessarily looking to start a new tradition, but you're just curious. And I really welcome people to that. Like, this isn't a book that is only for traditional witches or aspiring traditional witches. This is a book for everybody. So welcome, everybody.
Yes, so welcome, yeah. And I agree, like, there was so much good information just for, like, people should just know this stuff in general in this book that I thought it was fantastic. And then I don't know, I guess I'm kind of looking at it as like bonus information. The bonus information on the traditional witchcraft path itself was like really, really juicy because that was the stuff I didn't know anything about at all. So I have to say, like, your YouTube channel is incredible and I just get a kick out of it.
Thank you. That's really nice to hear because a lot of times, like, I find that I end my videos by being like, hope this made sense. Hope this, hope you got something from this because I'm just I just ramble and...
We were having a little chuckle about that, about how your videos tend to end with like, that's all I have to say. I hope that makes sense. I should probably stop now.
I know. And I say that, I find that I say a lot too. I'm like, I should stop saying this. I should just, be like, okay, bye. Like, but I always have to add this disclaimer of like, I think that's just like the Midwest coming out in me where I'm like, oh, like, I'm sorry.
No, I think it's charming and endearing, personally. So
I agree.
But thank you so much for joining us. If you wouldn't mind sharing like your website and your YouTube address and reminding everyone what the book title is and when it's coming out, that would be fantastic.
Sure. Well, first I just want to say thanks for having me on this. So it's really exciting for me, and I've become a really big fan of your show. So just being able to be a part of it is really awesome.
Thank you.
The title of my book, again, is The Crooked Path, An Introduction to Traditional Witchcraft. And you can pretty much buy it all on all the online book places. And if you want to read more of my work, I write a blog called By Athame and Sting over at Patheos Pagan. And I publish a little bit more frequently these days than I have in the past. And I also have a YouTube channel. If you just search for Kelden on YouTube, I believe it pops up. Those are the two places where if you want to hear more of what I have to say, you can find more. I did co-create an Oracle deck, a Witch's deck, with my good friend Maggie Alram. She is the artist behind it. I wrote the little companion book, and that was a really cool thing.
Well, thank you so much again for joining us. I really appreciate it.
And, thank you for joining us. It was a pleasure to talk to you.
Oh, thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to the We Witches 3 podcast. For show notes and links, please go to www.wewitches3.com.